In this lesson, we will learn about responsive grids. We will begin by learning what a grid is and what it's used for. Then we will take a look at grids from a responsive angle. And finally, we will learn how to write our own code to create a responsive grid from scratch. Let's get started. We will begin with a question. What is a grid? A grid is a tool that graphic designers use to make sure that their layouts follow a uniform and balanced structure. If you've ever looked at a magazine or newspaper or website or app and thought that everything was perfectly laid out, there's a good chance that whoever designed that product used a grid structure. In front of you is one of the world's most popular grids. This is a 12-column grid. Now let's imagine that you and I are designing a new website together. This grid is our blank canvas. So let's imagine that we want 4 columns in our website for 4 articles. There are the 4 columns. Now visitors of our website won't see the red lines, they will simply see the 4 columns. The grids or the red lines are only there for us during the design stages. Now the reason the 12-column grid is so common is because 12 is divisible by many useful numbers. So if we wanted 4 columns, we can see that each one of our columns takes up 3 red bars. A red bar is referred to as a column, and the space between 2 red bars is referred to as a gutter. A key concept is that we don't want to begin or end one of our website columns in a gutter. We want our website content to cleanly align with the red bars or with the 12 columns of the grid layout. By respecting the gutters, our layouts will have uniform margins and clean lines. So if, for example, instead of 4 columns on our website, we wanted 3, a bit of arithmetic tells us that each one of our columns should span 4 of the red bars. If we wanted our website to have 2 columns, obviously each should span 6 of the red bars. Obviously, our different columns don't always have to be equal to one another, so if we wanted to follow the rule of thirds and have our main column take up 2/3 of the space and have a sidebar take up 1/3 of the space, we could use an 8-4 split of our 12-column grid. Now the benefits of using a grid might not be obvious until we realize that our website is made up of multiple rows of columns. And as a designer, we don't want to be inventing new horizontal rhythms for each row. Using a grid helps us establish one unified horizontal rhythm and stick with that rhythm throughout the entirety of our layout. And that goes a long way towards pleasing the human eye and making our layout feel cohesive. So now that we've established what a grid is and why it might be a good idea to use one, we need to discuss how we can apply this notion of a grid to the modern day web browser. So let's give ourselves a concrete goal to work towards. I've put together a few rough draft sketches of a layout that I would like to create. So this is what the layout should look like at the desktop level. The main column on the left will have 4 callouts or 4 subcolumns, and then it will have 2 photographs. The blue content on the side represents a sidebar. So this is a large desktop monitor. Once we get down to a medium desktop monitor or a laptop, I want the callouts in the main column to sit 2 per row instead of 4 per row like we had on the large desktop version. Once we get down to a tablet, we want to make the sidebar, the blue area, simply stack below what used to be the main column. And the callouts and photographs will again sit 2 per row. And once we get down to a smartphone, everything should sit 1 per row, so single column, with the exception of the green, which is 2 photographs. So that's the responsive layout that I would like to achieve at the different screen sizes. Now here we are in the web browser. And this is a page that I've put together behind the scenes, and it has all of the content that we were just looking at in those rough draft sketches. Only there's been 0 layout applied. So even though the content is here, nothing's being floated, we don't see any columns. Now behind the scenes, I've written CSS that creates a responsive grid system. Now what we're going to do together is wrap this content that's making up the page in certain divs with specific class names in order to create the different layouts for different screen sizes that we looked at earlier. Now, most responsive grid systems adopt a mobile-first approach, and the code that I set up is no different. So I'm going to resize my web browser to resemble that of a smartphone, and we can see that our layout is actually almost already complete at the smartphone level, because for the most part we just want elements to sit one per row. However, we did want, even at the mobile level, for these two photographs to sit side by side. So in our text editor, here's the HTML, and I will look for those two images. Here they are. And here is the code that we will use to create the two columns for the two images. We want to create a row, so I'll create a div with a class of row. And within this div, we want to create one div for each column. So we want two columns. So I'll give this element a class of call for column, and then I'll give it a second class of call XS6. Now I will explain this naming scheme in just a moment, but for the time being, if it doesn't make sense, that's perfectly okay. Now we want two of these because we wanted one for each image. So I'm just going to copy and paste, and then let's cut and paste each image into these newly created divs. So if we save and refresh, you can see that the two images now sit side by side. Now let's review this naming scheme. Call stands for column. We'll circle back to XS in just a moment. 6 is relating to the 12-column grid. So if we want two columns, half of 12 is 6. Now regarding XS, this stands for extra small. So in my responsive grid system, I refer to smartphones as extra small or XS. I refer to tablets as small or SM. I refer to laptops as MD or medium. And I refer to large desktop monitors as LG or large. Now we are using a mobile-first approach. So this means that because we targeted extra small, column extra small 6, those two images will sit side by side one another no matter what size device our users are using. So our layout is already complete for the smartphone device size. Let's move on now to the tablet size. If you recall our rough draft sketches, the only difference between the smartphone layout and the tablet layout is that we wanted our callouts to sit two per row once we get to the tablet size. So in our HTML, we will find those boxes. Here they are. So I will begin by creating a row. Div with a class of row. Now within this row, I'm going to create 4 different columns. Call for column. Then I'll give this element an additional class of column small, which stands for tablet. Now again, we want these to sit 2 per row. So using the 12-column grid, we'll use 6. Now there are 4 of these callouts, so I'll copy and paste this div so that there are 4 of them. Next, I will scroll down a bit. Here's the code that was used to create one of those blue boxes. So I'll grab one of them, delete the others, and then paste them in to each of these different 4 columns that we just set up. So if I save and refresh, we can see that now at the tablet level, these blue boxes or these callouts sit 2 per row. And if I resize my browser to resemble that of a smartphone, we can see that they still only sit 1 per row. This is because we chose a class of call small 6. By targeting small, this class's styles will only be applied to devices that are a certain size or larger. So our layout is complete for the tablet size. Now if you recall back to our rough draft sketches, the only difference between the medium desktop and the tablet version is that the medium desktop version should have a sidebar that sits on the right side instead of stacking beneath the main content. So in our HTML, we'll scroll towards the top and create a div with a class of row. Now we're going to create 2 columns. One, we will say call medium 8, and the second div will have a class of call and call medium 4. So this will be the main column, and this will be the sidebar. We're following the rule of thirds. So in terms of our 12-column grid, we're using an 8-4 split. So now I'm simply going to cut and paste all of the main column content into this div, and I'll cut and paste all of the sidebar content into this div. So the main column content starts here and ends here, so I will cut that, paste it in here, and the sidebar content begins here and ends here, so I'll cut that and paste here. So if I save and refresh, we can see that we now have a 2-column layout. But if I shrink my window down to resemble a tablet, we can see that again the sidebar stacks beneath the main content. This is because we chose a class of call MD for medium. So these classes of call medium 4 and call medium 8 will only be applied to the page if the device is medium sized or larger. Now if we think back to our rough draft sketches, the only difference between the medium desktop and large desktop layouts is that we want the callouts in the main column to sit 4 per row for large desktop monitors. So in the web browser, I'm going to resize my browser to be quite large, and then hop over to the HTML, search for the columns that are making up those boxes. Here they are. They have a class currently of column small 6. So that means for tablet size and larger, they should take up half the width. We're going to add an additional class of column large 3. So if we think back to the 12-column grid, to create 4 pieces of content per row, we know that 12 divided by 4 is 3. And we only want this style to be applied to devices that are large. So then I will add this new class to the additional 3 remaining columns. So now if we save and refresh, we can see that because my screen is considered large, the callouts now sit 4 per row. But if I resize my window back to a medium desktop size, they sit 2 per row. So we can see that these 2 classes are working in harmony. We can layer in different class names that are targeting different screen sizes to create the desired layout. So our responsive layout is now complete. Now in the beginning of this lesson, I promised that we would learn how to write code ourselves from scratch. And throughout this lesson, we've only been looking at HTML. I wrote the CSS that accompanies these class names behind the scenes. So now, to keep my word, I'm going to remove all of that CSS and we are going to write it together. So behind the scenes, I just deleted all of the CSS that was creating the responsive grid system, that was corresponding with the class names we were using. And you can see this is what we're left with. Simple content that has no layout, nothing's being floated, there are no columns. However, all of our HTML is still intact. So we still have rows and we still have columns and we still have our specific class name systems. Now we just need to write the corresponding CSS together that applies the correct width and float and padding values to correspond with these names. So let's get started. Here we are in the style sheet, and the first thing that I'm going to do is to make sure that at the bottom where we have our clearfix code, instead of group, I want to make sure that I can also simply add row to a parent element and have it automatically clear its floated children. So with the row clearfix solution in place, we can begin writing the actual logic to our grid system. So the first rule that I will create is call for column. In our HTML, you will remember that every column received a base class of call, as well as additional classes to tell them how much space to take up for different devices. But the base call class is important, so we want all columns to be floated to the left. Next, let's write the code that selects the extra small half width column. So you will remember that we wanted the images to sit 2 per row even at the extra small smartphone level. So this seems like a logical place to begin in our CSS. So if an element receives this class, we want it to take up half of the available width. Now if an element doesn't receive any of the classes that we've specified so far, we want them to take up the full available width. So if we save and refresh, we can see that the 2 images now sit 2 per line. However, we are missing gutters or margins between our elements. So if you think back to the original graphic of the 12-column grid with the red bars, there was spacing between each of the 12 red columns. We refer to that as the gutter. So to add that back into our code, in the universal column rule that is applied to all columns, we can say padding right, 20 pixels, box sizing, border box. That way the padding does not adjust the overall calculated width of the elements. Now if we save and refresh, you can see that our code added gutters to the right of each of our columns. However, we don't need a gutter at the very end of our row. We only need gutters in between columns. So to counteract this at a CSS level, what we can do is target the row element that houses our columns. So you'll see a div with a class of row is used every time we want to create a row of columns. Now in our CSS, we can target that and give it a margin right value of -20 pixels. This is related to the padding that we just added. So if we save and refresh, we can see that we still maintain a gutter between the two columns, but we don't have extra gutter at the end of our row. Excellent. Now we simply need to make sure that our style sheet has all of the possible values, 1 through 11, to accommodate the 12-column grid. So 6 is obviously 50% of 12. 3 is obviously 25% of 12. Now instead of you watching me perform this very basic arithmetic, I'm simply going to paste in rules for 1 through 11. Now remember, we are using the extra small or mobile size as our baseline. So these rules do not need to be within a media query. We want these to be applied to every device under the sun. However, once we bump up from extra small to small, we want those classes to only be applied to screens of a certain size. So we can use a media query to say, only if a device is at least 768 pixels wide, should you then act on these classes that use the small prefix. So we now have our XS for extra small classes in place. We have our SM for small classes in place. So that takes care of smartphones and tablets. Now we need to take care of our medium size. So we can create an additional media query, say media screen and min width 1024 pixels. So only if a device is at least 1024 wide do we want it to honor these class names that use the MD or medium prefix. And finally, let's take care of our large classes. So we'll create one final media query, media screen, and min width 1280 pixels. So only if a device is at least this wide should it honor our class names that use the LG for large abbreviation. So with all of this in place, if we save and refresh and make our browser window larger, you can see that we hit the small or tablet level and we have 2 callouts per row. If we hit the medium size, you can see again we have the sidebar. And once we hit the large size, we have the 4 callouts per row. Now very quickly, you will remember that we set the gutter to be 20 pixels, which looks good at the extra small size. But I think once we get up to the tablet or small size, our gutter should be 40 pixels. So to make that change, I'll simply hop over to our style sheet, scroll up to where our small classes live within this media query. I'll select the universal call class and say padding right. It should be 40 pixels instead of 20. Now remember, to counteract that, we need to address the parent row element and make sure that its margin right value is a negative value that matches the padding we just set. So if we save and refresh, we can see the gutter is now larger for every size except the extra small mobile level. And that will bring this lesson to a close. I realized there was a lot to soak in this lesson. You might need to watch it more than once. And at the end of the day, if you don't want to use a grid, you don't have to. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't familiarize you with at least one grid system. I encourage you to download the demo files for this lesson and experiment with the classes yourself, creating your own unique layouts. Have fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.